Tom Horton again. I had no intention of talking about this. It's not what I came here tonight, but I don't know Steve, but I grew up in Hermosa, and what makes Hermosa Beach the best little beach town is the sense of community that we have here that you won't find in surrounding beach communities. And the service that they provide, since I was a little kid, can't be matched. And my kids have enjoyed the same level of service too. They've even provided, fixing a flat tire for free when my kid didn't have any money to pay for it, didn't want to walk home, batteries for night lights out of their own pocket. And it just, to me, it would be such a shame to lose that sense of service, that sense of community that they provide, that value that they provide to all of us. It'd be like having a Walmart move in to the city where you just lose the mom and pops. And I know times are changing. I'm not anti-technology, but I like the city for what it is, and it's a community. I want to keep it that way.
Thank you. Anyone else? Seeing no one, I will close public comment and bring it back to council. I guess I'm going to just start the discussion on this one briefly, since I had a chance to hear Steve's take on it weeks ago. I'm going to start with the ordinance. The ordinance concerns me because it allows us to permit bike sharing operations. And if our intent is anything other than that, adopting an ordinance that allows it, but then somehow explicitly or implicitly directing the city manager not to actually issue any permits puts us in a bad position, and potentially a legally bad position, because somebody who is denied a permit could say, well, your law says I can get a permit if I do this. So I think the ordinance will need to be drafted to reflect what council's opinion is. I think Hermosa Cyclery is obviously a huge asset. I don't know how many times we've all been there to put air in our tires. I've been there countless times with my family. And as Steve says, they're always there to answer questions. And that type of thing, on the scale that they do it, is a huge commitment, because it takes their staff willing to engage and willing to spend a fair bit of their time answering people's questions and giving them that individualized service that Hermosa Cyclery has provided for a long period of time. Steve is also a huge member of our community. I specifically remember when we were fighting over whether or not to not allow businesses to have plastic bags. Steve didn't wait for the city to do that. Steve went out and bought a bunch of reusable bags for Hermosa Cyclery to use. That's the kind of leadership that he provided. And ultimately, I think it's worth closing the book on the issue of plastic bags in the city by noting that Hermosa residents approved of the statewide ordinance to ban plastic bags in California 2-1. People in Hermosa Beach care. Steve Collins cares. The bike corral at the Fiesta and all the other events is a huge part of our community. I don't believe the cost is prohibitive. In fact, I think it's a screaming deal to go down and get a beach cruiser for a day for $20 to $30, or to get a townie bike or whatever it is, to spend the day cruising up and down the Strand. Maybe you can get as far as Santa Monica. I've done it. Lots of people probably do. So the recreational market, I think, is well served in Hermosa Beach by Hermosa Cyclery, and that's absolutely something that we ought to protect. I think bike share is coming. I think our neighboring cities, whether it be Venice, which is part of the city of Los Angeles, ends up with dockless bike share, those bikes are going to end up down here. It's not that far of a ride. And so we need to prepare for that. And it seems to me like the best way to do that is the condition that Steve suggested, which is geofence the Strand, because bike sharing, in my mind, is good for commuting. It's good for facilitating people using bikes. These aren't the type of bikes that are really that appropriate for recreational use. Recreational use, in my mind, is a beach cruiser, something with a comfortable seat, something that has a little heft beneath your feet when you want to ride it up and down the Strand, which is basically flat terrain. Bike share bikes, as I've seen them, and Mobike is the best that I've seen, partly because the color scheme is good. They're gray and orange. They look nice. They're simple bikes. But they are very simple bikes. They're lightweight. They're great for commuting. So let's say, for example, you're somebody who lives in the tree section in Manhattan Beach, and you have an office at a WeWork type space down by the Hermosa Beach Pier, and you come down each day. Well, you grab one of those bikes somewhere by your house, and you ride it, and you get off of it, and you leave it down here. But you come down Hermosa Avenue, or you come down Valley and Ardmore. You don't use it on the Strand and get into the recreational business. There is a role for it. I think it is coming. I think managing it is going to be the challenge, and I think Steve's suggestion of geofencing is probably the only way that we can protect the existing bike rental market that is adequately served by our bricks and mortar that we value, while also making bike share available to people who might use it to commute. And with that, I will go ahead and turn to my right for any discussion. Councilmember Petty.
Just so I can get a little clarity on the geofencing, does that mean that the price goes up if we geofence, or they're not allowed in that zone?
You could do either one, and I should add that I think Julian's suggestion of putting a committee together or adding to the committee that's already been formed of the 3 cities, including El Segundo and Beach Cities Health District, by getting some bike share representatives, getting our bike coalition representatives, getting some of our bricks and mortar bike rental shops involved, is the way we work through exactly the type of question you're asking, because I think you can do anything, which is, I think you can have it, an electric bike, geofencing means that the electric motor throttles back and you can't ride it more than 8 miles an hour if you're within a geofenced area, so that you're within the speed limit. I'm guessing that it's not a huge stretch for the technology to basically put the brakes on when you get into a geofenced area. So the bike slowly comes to a stop, 10 feet into the geofenced area. So if you try to ride it to the end of Pier Plaza onto the Strand, that bike won't go anywhere. You have to turn it around and get it back out of the geofenced area, and then it'll ride just fine. But you could also presumably do it where it automatically does surge pricing. So it goes from, $1 for a half hour to $10 for a half hour, and thereby eliminating any reasonable incentive for somebody to use a bike share program where Hermosa Cyclery, for example, is providing bikes to our recreational market. That was a long answer, so I hope that helps.
Still not understanding, but I hear what you're saying. So this is the thing, and the reason I was saying it was because in the end, and I really appreciate Julian's point, and I agree with you in forming a committee, but also to Jeff's point, it has to be multi-jurisdictional. Because if everybody has their own rules and somebody rents a bike in Santa Monica and starts heading south, and then something happens when they come into Hermosa, they're not going to know what's going on. It's going to be very discombobulated. And this is why I think that we can't make a decision like this from the dais, because it's way too complicated. But something that I was thinking, Steve, as you were talking, was that I think what everybody wants is to grow the universe of people who ride bikes. However, if we're not careful, it's not going to do that. It's purely going to be a rip and replace of you. But that doesn't accomplish our goal. So how do you accomplish the goal of increasing the universe of people who would cycle as opposed to driving their car around? I don't know, but that's why I think it would be good to get people together. That's why I asked Leanne, and I thought your presentation was great, but I do think it's somewhat generic because it's coming from the bike share people that pitch the bike share concept. So it's not tailored for our community because, it was said before as we've all been deliberating, we don't necessarily have the metro stops going on in our town and people having to get places. It makes sense if you were taking the bus up to downtown and then you have to get to your office that's a little further away. Then I totally understand that, but we're not in that mode here. So I think that the goal, which is increasing the universe, is something that we need to figure out. Because what I don't want to have happen, which is what's happening across the country with what we see with technology, is that employees are gone, people are losing their jobs, taxes are disappearing, and you lose businesses that pay rent, and then just becomes a downward spiral from there. The fact that you've got 19 employees these bike share companies, I don't know how many employees they have. We don't see them around here, and noticeably, none of them are here in this room tonight saying we want to be part of your community, so we know where they stand. Let me see, because I was just making some notes, because there were some just really great comments. There has to be continuity with whatever happens, or we're all going to look kind of silly. Let's see here. I wasn't completely clear on the whole electric bike thing, and then I was trying to look. Leanne, help me understand. Do some of these bike shares, some of them electric, some of them aren't?
Correct. Some operations in some jurisdictions have implemented all-electric bike share systems. Some are looking at doing a mixed fleet where they have one operator is offering both traditional bikes and e-bikes, and others where they've got the docking stations, and it's just there are multiple different operators in the same jurisdiction, and one of them offers e-bikes.
Okay. So again, adding to the complexity. Okay, question for the lawyer. Somebody rents one of these bikes, and then they have a bike accident. I'm sure they signed some liability waiver, but then they blame it on the city, and they don't have a helmet, and then they have a serious head injury. Does it come back to the city, or do they indemnify us? Do these bike share companies
Right.
indemnify?
I wrote the user agreement for West Hollywood's bike share, and we put in very specific language that they are responsible for any injury. It doesn't come back to the city, that by using their bikes, that they're agreeing to go by the rules and essentially indemnifying the city.
Got it, okay.
Injury.
Got it, okay. So, this is the thing. I really have an issue with us promoting something where people don't wear helmets. That really bothers me. I understand that adults can make their own decisions. But ironically, we just had a meeting at the community center. It was that Love Your Brain Foundation, where they were stressing the importance to people of wearing helmets. And just now that it would just be kind of this cavalier thing of, well, people don't really have to wear helmets, that bothers me too. So I'm just pointing all these things out because I am definitely in support of a multi-jurisdictional subcommittee that's formed with different voices. And I would ask Sergio that it includes Manhattan and Redondo, and if it's El Segundo, and it probably should extend a little further out, but somehow people have to put their heads together. The bigger it is, the more difficult it's going to be to reach some kind of consensus. But at a minimum, Manhattan, Redondo, Hermosa have to be aligned. And I don't want to move forward on that ordinance because, as the mayor said, and I agree with him, it's conflicting, and I don't really think we're there yet anyway. So that's what I would support if we have enough people who want to move forward in that direction. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. In that direction is to form the multi-jurisdictional committee or expand it and work through.
Yeah, so it's the two things. It's that, and then it's also not passing this ordinance either tonight as it currently is written.
Okay. Thank you, Councilmember Fangary.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So a lot of good discussions and a lot of some questions answered, some questions that we still need to look into. But I think one of the questions that I'm hearing from the community is, why are we even talking about this? So we just want to address this. A couple of people already mentioned it. We expect it to happen. It's happening, in a lot of different areas and cities. There's a bike share that Metro just adopted. It's basically a block from my office. It's right outside 7th and Metro in downtown LA, and people take the train to 7th and Metro, and they can go and take a bike and go wherever they need to go. I'm assuming there's similar bike racks at Union Station and any of the other big areas in downtown, but we're not downtown. We're Hermosa Beach, and it's different here. But it is expanding and it's going everywhere, and we just have to have that conversation and see what makes sense for Hermosa Beach. So that's why we're talking about it. And in my take on it, the focus should be working with the other cities. Hermosa Beach is too small to have any kind of bike share, and I think most people in this room probably think that I already have a bike. What do I care about bike share? Because I have a bike in my garage, and I'll just take a bike to go wherever I need. So the idea is, if it's not connected with the other neighboring cities, I think it's going to be useless and not going to serve a purpose that we're trying to do. Hermosa Cyclery, Steve, you gave us a really good presentation, which I really appreciate. But I think you should have known before today how much the community appreciates everything you guys do for the community. Every nonprofit event that I've been to, there's one of your bicycles there being offered for a silent auction or for a raffle. So we really appreciate that, and I don't think anybody in the council or staff, when they put this agenda together, was thinking, let's do something so we can get Hermosa Cyclery out of business or to get competition. But like I said, this is something that we know it's happening. We just have to have the conversation to figure out something that works, that addresses the issue and hopefully, protects Hermosa Cyclery and other small businesses in our community. So I think Steve already mentioned the focus, I think, on something that does not compete with the recreational area of bike rentals is the first mile, last mile. So that would be something that I would be more focused on in the discussion. How do we get people that either riding bikes or other transportation need to get somewhere to the last mile, or they have this idea of going somewhere one way and having another means of transportation the other way, but not focused on the Strand recreational rental. I know little about the electric bikes, so I'm not a big fan unless I know more about it. I know Carolyn mentioned the safety issues, which also concern me about likely not to have them with helmets. Obviously, the faster they are, the more safety concerns that I have. So if we are having a discussion from my standpoint, I'm less optimistic about having electric bikes and more likely to be supportive of something that's traditional bikes. I totally agree with the comments that were made by my colleagues about having a committee of, including other cities working together, including possibly somebody from the bike share companies or organization. But my concern, if you include them in the conversation, is that it might tailor the conversation on to what they can do to get that in. So I'll leave it up to you guys to think about whether or not it makes sense to do this at the early stage or maybe down the line. And I also agree with the comments made by the mayor and Carolyn that I'm uncomfortable with an ordinance that gives somebody the impression they can get a permit, unless it's very clear that the permit would not be. I mean, it could be just the one paragraph that our city attorney can put in, that this ordinance does not authorize giving permits unless there's a future action by the council. I would be okay with that kind of disclaimer, but I would rather just have a limitation of you can do it rather than you can't do it unless you have a permit. And then lastly, on the motorized bikes and the safety issues, since it was brought up today, I'll mention, as I see that our police chief and captain are in the back of the room. I'm hearing some concerns from our residents about motorized bikes on the Strand. I know we have this flashing light sign that we use sometimes to let people know about things that they're not allowed to do in Hermosa Beach. So maybe one suggestion, if it's not being used, to tell people other things like not smoke or other restrictions, that maybe we could consider having a sign that basically says motorized bicycles are not allowed on the Strand, as a reminder to our residents, because frankly, I don't know that a lot of people know that, and I am seeing them more and more on the Strand than they were before. I'm not aware of any accidents or safety issues yet, but I just think that people are concerned about it, and I think it's probably, an accident's probably coming, so maybe we should do something proactively to let people know that that's not allowed. And that concludes my comments. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
If I can just jump in on the Strand-related stuff. I know we've been talking about the need to, from an enforcement perspective, we also have an 8-mile-per-hour speed limit, and that seems to be an easier enforcement tactic than looking at the electric bikes, because a lot of those are pedal assist, and so I can have an electric bike where I turn the pedal assist component off, and it still looks like an electric bike, but they may not be using that. So I think that's one of the things that we're trying to focus on, is looking at the speed at which the bikes are traveling, because that is the more dangerous condition when they're going above 10 or 12 miles an hour.
All right, thank you, Henny. Mr. Mayor Pro Tem, any discussion?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think I'm generally in agreement with, with my colleagues here in terms of forming this larger kind of working group. I think that makes a lot of sense. I would remind everybody that, we did the bike master plan. That was 7 cities working together to form that plan, so we know it can work in terms of cooperative effort. And in fact, I'd like to see the South Bay Bike Coalition play some role in that discussion. I think I see it a little differently about the electric bikes on the Strand, because we already have a problem with motorized skateboards, scooters, and bikes on the Strand in growing numbers, and it is against the law. We don't need to create an ordinance and to tell us that you can't do that. We just have never enforced it. So, and you're right, and we do have a speed limit. It's rarely enforced either. You know, I just would like to see some signage on the Strand that just says no motorized bikes, scooters, or skateboards, and show that we mean it. And, you know, we've already created an environment that's becoming progressively less safe on the Strand, and the Strand can get quite quite crowded. So I'd like to see something a little more vigorous in that regard, in terms of we have existing laws and ordinances that, you know, provide us with some protection here. And if you have a motorized, I mean, you can be pedaling your electric bike, you know what I mean? It's real easy to tell when somebody's operating a motorized, you know, vehicle, whatever it might be. So, I don't know, I'd like to see that. I'd like us to take some specific action. I'm not altogether sure that we couldn't pass some kind of, or at least some formative ordinance, you know, that would have the skeletal language in terms of protecting us against, you know, sort of the pirated renegade kind of thing, operations, you know, without the additional language. I suppose the whole thing could come back if we want, but, you know, that's kind of, I don't see why we couldn't do that tonight. I think there's sufficient language there that would cover that. And
Well-
then if we changed our mind in terms of what we're going to do, we can always add additional language.
Yeah, I was going to suggest a two-pronged motion. One would be to direct staff to come back with an ordinance which basically just prohibits bike share. And then a second prong is creating a committee, an expanded committee, to work through the issues on a multi-jurisdictional, multi-stakeholder basis. I think if we're going to have the bike share folks who are in contact with us already, especially if they're going to be on the committee, it certainly will help us with leverage in terms of the conditions they're going to have to meet before we would permit it, for us to have an ordinance in place which says you can't do it in Hermosa Beach. So you can't backdoor it by getting, you know, Redondo Beach or someone to allow you to do it, and then have people spill
My
over
only
into our city.
concern about having the bike share companies there is that, well, which ones do you invite and not invite? You know, I think if you had a working group and you had a workshop where you invited all the ones who wanted to attend, and you got the input, I think would be as valuable as having, because it's the question of who do you include and who do you not include in that discussion.
Well, the committee could sort that out, I would suspect. I mean, they would have to, because it's a changing landscape. They're coming and going all the time. You know, I mean, and the technology's evolving, so it would be hard. We know who's contacted us, so those people have already expressed interest, but
And it may be that we form our committee and have a game plan and then approach those companies separate from that committee to have that discussion of potential options. Kind of a two-piece process, because again, they are very eager. They're calling, emailing on a regular basis. They're ready to come test them out, drop them off, do whatever they can. And so that is why we are trying to keep them a bit at arm's length, because they will try and push just about anything at this point.
sure. It's all the more reason why we need to get an ordinance in place which says you can't do it until we say you can. Do you have any more comments?
No, I mean, I think we're generally in agreement.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councilmember Armato.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I agree generally with the 2 points that you brought up. We need an ordinance that prohibits them in our city, and have a working group, but I certainly think that Steve needs to be on that committee. I will reiterate what an important asset you are and Hermosa Cyclery is to our community. Not unlike a lot of our local businesses, but you in particular, with bike rentals, and I mean, we've all gone by and filled up with air. We've done it with our stroller even. You're extremely generous for any event in town. We just had the Glow Ride in town, and you donated all of those bikes for a nonprofit event, and we value you, and I don't. And I want to make sure that you and your business is not compromised by any of the decisions that we make here tonight. So I'll cut it kind of short and be in agreement with your couple points.
All right, so my suggestion is we move to direct staff to bring back an ordinance which simply prohibits bike share. And then we also direct staff to participate in an expanded committee of stakeholders and jurisdictions in our area to work through a proposal for how bike share might work in our area, in our city in particular.
I'll
Is that the
second.
motion?
That can be the motion.
I'll second it.
All right. All right. Any discussion? Hearing none, I will call the question. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. All right, so I want to suggest we take a break.